In the summer of 1988, an armored vehicle carrying $1.9 million in Union funds vanished without a trace in Detroit. The transport was later discovered abandoned, the money missing, and both crew members dazed but unharmed. Despite extensive investigation, the case went cold. No evidence, no arrests, no solutions. Over 3 decades later, a volunteer at a non-profit organization sorting through a box of donated books found something unusual inside one of them: a folded meeting record listing the van's route on the day of the heist. One of the signatures on the document belonged to a man who, according to official records, wasn't even scheduled to work that day. In the summer of 1988, a scheduled cash transport operation disappeared in Detroit without leaving behind a single drop of blood, a broken lock, or a clear explanation. The armored vehicle, operated by the city's Transport Workers Union, had departed from its regular garage location in the early morning hours, following a confirmed route approved the day before. It carried an estimated $1.9 million in cash packed in sealed steel containers destined for a processing facility several districts away. On board were 2 union employees, Harold Price, a driver with over a decade of experience, and Marvin Daniels, a security officer known for his precise adherence to protocol. Everything appeared routine as the vehicle pulled away from the lot. The van was registered as on schedule by the dispatcher, and no mechanical issues had been reported in its previous service log. Both employees had checked in, and the rear cargo doors had been sealed as required by internal procedure. Daniels had logged the shipment in the manifest and noted the condition of the cash crates. Price had verified the tires, brakes, and gauges. Before setting out, no other staff accompanied the vehicle, and no police escort had been requested, standard practice for medium-sized weekday transfers at the time. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. At some point during the journey, something went wrong. Union dispatchers attempted contacting the van when it failed to arrive at its designated stop. There was no response, no distress call, no radio contact. 47 minutes after the van had departed the garage, it effectively disappeared. Attempts to trace it through route checkpoints failed. No one had seen it cross the usual intersections. Traffic reports from the period didn't indicate any major accidents or detours along the projected path. The van had not arrived at the processing facility. It had not returned to the garage. It was simply missing. Roughly 90 minutes later, the missing vehicle was located. An anonymous caller had reported an abandoned van parked near a shuttered warehouse in Highland Park, an industrial zone with declining business activity and minimal foot traffic. Responding officers arrived to find the vehicle with its doors open. The interior was intact. No obvious signs of damage, forced entry, or emergency braking were visible. The back compartment, where the sealed crates had been stored, was completely empty. The lock showed no signs of forced tampering. Inside the van, both Harold Price and Marvin Daniels were found unconscious but alive. Daniels was discovered seated upright in the front passenger seat with no visible injuries. Price was lying inside the rear cargo bay, positioned on the floor. Medics confirmed both men were breathing and had stable vitals, though disoriented and slow to respond. Once stabilized, both men reported memory gaps. Price recalled a sharp, unusual odor shortly before blacking out. Daniels had no clear recollection beyond the vehicle being parked, followed by dizziness and sudden fatigue. Toxicology screens were inconclusive. There were no traces of tranquilizers or narcotics in their systems. However, both men displayed temporary irritation in their eyes and respiratory tracts, symptoms consistent with exposure to an airborne irritant or aerosolized agent. Forensics found no fingerprints besides those of the 2 crew members. No tools, masks, or containers were recovered from the scene. The $1.9 million was gone without a trace. The initial investigation focused on the possibility of an internal leak. Access to the van's route and departure schedule had been limited to a select group within the union's logistics division. Investigators reviewed shift rosters, dispatch logs, and internal phone records. They cross-referenced personnel lists with financial activity and alibi statements. One name stood out early in the inquiry: Edward Holt, a former driver who had resigned from the transport unit in late 1987. His departure had raised no suspicion at the time, but investigators learned that Holt maintained informal contact with several union employees and had reportedly visited the garage on multiple occasions over the past year. Although he no longer had authorized access, Holt's name appeared in an internal dispatch call log just 2 days before the incident, a record of an incoming call from his home number. The content of the call was unknown, and there were no recordings. A warehouse worker also stated that he had seen a car resembling Holt's sedan idling near the Highland Park storage site on the morning of the theft. Though he couldn't provide a license plate or confirm the identity of the driver, Holt was brought in for questioning. He denied any involvement in the theft and claimed he had spent the day at home working on his car. His alibi was unverified, and he offered no witnesses. A search of his financial records revealed no abnormal cash flow, and investigators found no physical evidence tying him to the van, its contents, or the location where it was abandoned. Without probable cause or grounds for continued detention, police released him. He remained a person of interest, but the investigation stalled due to lack of actionable leads. Over the next 3 months, the case stagnated. Hundreds of leads were reviewed, some based on sightings, others on rumors within the union. Detectives traced supply purchases, examined staffing irregularities, and interviewed dozens of employees. No suspect emerged with motive, opportunity, and access combined. Every crate of cash had vanished, along with any trace of its journey beyond the point of disappearance. The heist had left behind no usable clues, no paper trail, and no repeat attempts. It was a clean removal with professional timing. Speculation about external help, including possible organized crime involvement, was discussed but remained unproven. Eventually, the investigation was marked inactive. Files were archived. Daniels and Price both returned to limited duties, but later took early retirement under medical exemption. Officially, the case was labeled unresolved, one of the cleanest and most frustrating cash thefts in the city's history. At the time, no one could imagine that decades later, in an unrelated corner of the city, a stack of donated books would resurface a name long buried in the records and reopen questions thought long dead. In the spring of 2019, inside a modest used bookstore in Detroit called Community Reads, a quiet discovery began to unravel one of the city's longest dormant investigations. The shop regularly accepted donations from estate sales, libraries, and the public. Among these shipments, pallets of unsorted books and office materials often arrived in bulk. Lisa Harper, a college student completing her internship under investigative journalist Mark Davis, had been assigned the task of sorting through archival clutter. She spent her afternoon sifting through outdated ledgers, forgotten manuals, and fading notebooks. It was tedious work, rarely yielding anything of interest. Her internship had begun weeks earlier, tied to Davis's ongoing research for a podcast about unsolved crimes in Detroit. Lisa's role was administrative, and the odds of stumbling on something meaningful were close to none. That afternoon, Lisa was working through a stack of business records that appeared to originate from defunct civic organizations. Most of the documents were financial logs from the 1980s, payroll summaries, quarterly statements, minutes from mundane meetings. But tucked between the pages of an otherwise unremarkable bookkeeping ledger, Lisa found a single, loose sheet. Its texture and yellowed edges matched the age of the surrounding papers, but the content was unrelated. The heading identified it as an internal memorandum from a May 1988 union meeting issued by a transport workers' local chapter based in Detroit. What drew her attention was not the formatting or tag, but the details listed in the body of the document. It described a planned cash transport operation complete with date, departure point, and stop sequence. As she read further, Lisa recognized the route described. It matched the one followed by the armored van that had vanished during a high-profile heist in June of that same year. The discovery became even more troubling when she looked at the bottom of the page. There, alongside two other names, was the handwritten signature of Edward Holt. The name was familiar to her from one of Davis's research files. Holt had been briefly investigated in connection with the 1988 robbery. According to police records, he had not been scheduled to work that day and had no official reason to know the van's route. In fact, at the time of the crime, Holt was already listed as off-duty, and later reports identified him as having resigned from the union months before the incident. Yet, the signature appeared deliberate and confident. It was written in ink, not pencil, and showed no signs of being forged or copied. The document itself bore original creases, aging stains, and consistent wear, suggesting it had not been tampered with or recreated. Lisa initially hesitated, considering the possibility of a clerical error or a coincidental name match, but the date on the memo preceded the heist by just a few weeks, and the match between the route details and the stolen van's itinerary left little room for doubt. The memo had no reason to be in that ledger, and the ledger had no reason to include union meeting materials. There was no evidence that the document had ever been reviewed by police. No stamp, no tag, no file number. It was a loose page overlooked for decades, buried in paperwork that no one had bothered to open. She brought the memo to Davis without delay. He examined it silently, reading each line twice before turning the sheet over. There were no identifying marks on the back, but the content on the front spoke volumes. This was not a photocopy, nor a reproduction from an archive. It was a contemporaneous record, apparently from inside the organization involved in the transport, listing confidential details about the operation and bearing a signature from someone officially uninvolved. The implications were immediate. If Holt had access to the route before the van departed, then either the security of the operation had been breached from within, or Holt had maintained a channel of communication with those who had access to sensitive logistics long after his official departure. Davis knew that if this document was authentic, it could reopen questions that law enforcement had abandoned 3 decades earlier. Back in 1988, investigators had failed to identify a leak or insider support. They had no way to confirm whether Holt had coordinated with someone still working at the union or whether he had access to restricted materials through informal connections. But this piece of paper proved one thing beyond speculation. Holt had knowledge he wasn't supposed to possess. And the physical document survived the decades only because it had been misplaced, bundled into an unrelated ledger, and forgotten in a stack of obsolete financial records. The implications for the original investigation were significant. With this new lead, there was a reason to review the original suspect list, to examine who had attended that particular meeting, and to question whether the meeting had been recorded in any official minutes. If it hadn't, the existence of the memo raised further suspicions. Who preserved it, how it ended up among donated materials, and why it had never surfaced in the original probe were questions that still had no answers. But for the first time in over 30 years, the trail wasn't cold. Lisa had uncovered a document that never should have existed, bearing a signature that never should have appeared on it, describing details that had never been publicly released. The silence that had defined the case since 1988 had finally been broken. Mark Davis began with the most direct line of inquiry: the life and records of Edward Holt. The man whose signature had surfaced on a document he had no official reason to sign had died over a decade ago, but his paper trail was not yet cold. Holt had left his job at the Transportation Union in 1987. After that, he had worked in a local auto repair shop, earning modest wages, and living in a small house on the east side of Detroit. There were no red flags in his financial history, no luxury purchases, no criminal charges, no real estate acquisitions. He had passed away in 2007 from a heart attack, buried without much notice or estate. But what caught Davis's attention wasn't Holt himself. It was his son. In 1989, just a year after the armored van theft, Edward's only child, Daniel Holt, had enrolled at Harvard University. The enrollment record wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the method of payment. Tuition had been covered by a single lump sum deposit paid directly into the university's account, not by a parent, but through a third-party intermediary. The source was a private account linked to the name Charlene Green. Charlene Green had worked in the financial department of the same union. Her role was not high-ranking, but she had access to payroll systems and reimbursement records. According to union files, she had resigned in March 1988, just 3 months before the van vanished. But those same files contained inconsistencies. Her final pay stub was dated February, and there were no signed exit interviews or HR correspondence, only a scanned resignation letter in a generic format. Her tax filing ceased that same year. She appeared in one place in the police records from 1988. Her car had been reported near the area where the stolen van was found. At the time, the sighting was not pursued. Davis followed the connection. Archived rosters from 1986 to 1987 showed that both Holt and Green had frequently appeared on the same weekly schedules. Meeting records from the union's internal logistics team listed both of them as attendees in several overlapping sessions. These were not random intersections. They were assigned to departments that had reason to communicate. Holt was a veteran driver, and Green handled payments related to transport reimbursements. No direct communication between them was documented, but the pattern suggested professional familiarity. When Davis began reviewing financial accounts, he traced the third-party tuition payment back to a routing number in Georgia. From there, the trail led to a now-closed account under Green's name registered to a P.O. box with no active forwarding address. The account had seen 2 major transactions in 1989, one outflow to Harvard and one deposit 2 weeks earlier from a limited liability logistics company based in Texas. The Texas connection wasn't entirely new. In the original police file, one name had briefly appeared: Leon Butler. A witness had described seeing him standing near the Detroit warehouse on the morning of the heist. Butler had been a long-haul trucker with no formal ties to the union, and the lead was dropped after no local employment records were found. But in the years that followed, he had quietly registered a transport company in Texas, just months after the Detroit robbery. The business had no storefront, listed no full-time staff, and reported minimal taxable income. Yet for nearly 3 years, the company received small-scale contracts through a network of shell vendors. Digging deeper, Davis identified 2 of those vendors as briefly active subcontractors to armored cash transit firms operating in Missouri and Illinois. One had since been dissolved. The other had changed names 3 times before, finally going dark in 2002. Both had reported minor vehicle purchases that could have matched decommissioned security vans from the late 1980s. One of them, Davis discovered, had purchased a van at auction from a Detroit area dealer in August 1988, less than 8 weeks after the robbery. None of these details had been stitched together in the original investigation. The police had interviewed Holt, found no cash, no weapons, no matching getaway vehicle, and no witness willing to place him at the scene. He denied involvement and was released without charge. Green had never been questioned formally. Butler had never been located. The file was closed in 1989, and the $1.9 million was written off as unrecoverable. Now a new picture was beginning to form, Holt had access. Green had accounting authority. Butler had the means for transport, and someone had made sure Daniel Holt's tuition was paid in full just months after the cash disappeared. None of them were living lavishly, and none had been arrested. But the money had moved quietly, indirectly, and with enough planning to avoid attention for over 30 years. Davis knew the next step wasn't speculation. He needed verification that the routes Green and Holt once accessed were indeed altered or manipulated in 1988. He needed to know if Butler had ever returned to Michigan, and most of all, he needed to find out who else might have known about the document that had surfaced in 2019. The signature had been real, but someone else must have allowed that paper to exist in the first place. The heist was no longer just about missing cash. It was about the structure that allowed it to vanish unnoticed and the silence that kept it buried. Once the unsigned meeting document surfaced, Mark Davis knew the investigation could no longer remain confined to archives and speculation. He contacted the Detroit Police Department and submitted all verified findings. With the recovered 1988 Union document, the signature of Edward Holt, and financial records pointing to previously unexamined connections, authorities agreed that the case warranted reopening. The file was formally reclassified from cold to under active review. The first step was confirming the payment trail. Harvard University records showed that Daniel Holt's tuition for his freshman year in 1989 had been paid in full via a one-time deposit. The sum, significant even by Ivy League standards, was traced back to an account held by Charlene Green, a former accountant for the same transport union Holt had worked for. This was not a coincidence. Investigators discovered that shortly before this payment, a portion of the funds in Green's account had been transferred to a brokerage firm in Illinois through a shell company that dissolved within months of its formation. The money path had been deliberately routed to obscure its origins, but with financial forensics and updated federal databases, the connections were now traceable. Charlene Green was located in a suburb outside Columbus, Ohio. She had left her position in the Union months before the 1988 robbery and had since moved into the healthcare sector, working as administrative staff in a private clinic. The visit from detectives came unannounced. She initially expressed confusion, but once presented with the financial documentation, she admitted to facilitating the tuition payment. Her explanation was simple. She had been asked by a longtime friend to help out his son. She claimed she was told the funds were a family inheritance and that no questions needed to be asked. She repeated this phrase several times, but the documents told a different story. Investigators presented Green with a timeline that placed her in Detroit the same week as the robbery. Her car, a Chevrolet Caprice, had been identified in a 1988 police bulletin after a witness noted it near the abandoned warehouse where the van was found. At the time, the detail was considered too vague to pursue. Now it resurfaced with greater weight. Confronted with the timeline, Green's initial denial began to crack. Over 2 hours of questioning led to a partial confession. She admitted she had received money from Edward Holt, in cash. She admitted she had met him in Detroit days before the robbery and again shortly after it. She insisted she did not know the precise origin of the money, but acknowledged she had been told not to ask and had accepted the condition. With this, the investigators had their first confirmed post-crime contact between two of the suspected participants. Green was not arrested, but she was placed under active monitoring and labeled a cooperating witness. Another name surfaced from the old employee rosters, James Carey, a union mechanic listed as part of the internal logistics team during the late 1980s. Carey had never been questioned in depth during the original investigation. He had left Detroit in 1990, moving south under unclear circumstances. No taxes had been filed under his name since 1992, and there were no recent employment or vehicle records. Inquiries in Louisiana, where he was last seen, yielded no results. A missing persons report had never been filed, nor had Carey left behind a digital footprint. Authorities entered his name into the National Criminal Database under a warrant for questioning in relation to a historic financial crime involving organized conspiracy. His current location remained unknown, but his relevance to the operation was becoming increasingly clear. Meanwhile, paperwork tied to Leon Butler's now-defunct trucking business offered new direction. Though Butler had died in 2017, the company remained nominally active, likely due to an auto-renewal process on business registrations. A review of archived property leases led investigators to an old garage in eastern Michigan. Records indicated Butler had rented it under the company's name in mid-1988, just 1 month before the heist. The warehouse had changed hands multiple times since then, but the original lease agreement had been scanned into a municipal archive during a digitization project. This garage matched the dimensions and access layout of the location where the stolen van had been discovered, abandoned, stripped of contents, and wiped of prints. As more pieces came together, law enforcement worked in collaboration with the district attorney's office to reconstruct the logistics of the crime. They now had links between Holt, Green, Carey, and Butler. Each played a distinct role, Holt with route knowledge and operational access, Green with financial laundering, Carey likely involved in retrofitting or disguising the vehicle, and Butler with the transport and temporary concealment infrastructure. None of them had retained large visible assets over time, but the sudden payment for Daniel Holt's tuition, the shell company activity, and Green's quiet lifestyle in Ohio suggested the money had been carefully distributed, likely in cash, and concealed over decades. The case was now being framed not as a standard robbery, but as a coordinated inside job involving at least 4 individuals, each utilizing their position and relationships within the transport union to execute the heist without direct violence or exposure. The absence of surveillance footage in 1988 had worked in their favor, but 3 decades later, the paper trail and long-forgotten transactions were now their undoing. The remaining question for prosecutors was not whether these individuals had been involved, but how precisely they had coordinated the execution without attracting attention, and who else, if anyone, had helped them disappear so cleanly after the fact. More evidence was still needed before charges could be filed, but the investigation had officially turned from archival curiosity to criminal inquiry. The net was tightening. During the reconstruction, investigators revisited a document found in 2019, a route log discovered inside an old accounting ledger at the warehouse of a closed union office. Among the other signatures on it was the name of Edward Holt, a driver who had been dismissed back in 1987. At first, it seemed like an archival error or an old copy, but based on the date and the content of the log, it became clear the document referred specifically to the day of the robbery, August 2nd, 1988. It turned out that the log was a draft version printed in advance for internal route coordination. At the time, such documents didn't immediately make it into the official records. Some circulated within the transport department and could be signed by people who temporarily assisted with paperwork. During questioning, a former logistics coordinator admitted that despite being fired, Holt had shown up at the building a few times and once helped sort through the paperwork before a major route overhaul. He was not officially on staff, but his signature could have appeared on documents that weren't intended for archiving. That's exactly the kind of paper that was mistakenly filed with the draft route plans. No one noticed it until it ended up in a used bookstore where part of the disbanded archive was sold off in the 1990s. This moment became critical. The document proved that Holt had access to the van routes on the very day of the robbery. This not only indicated his involvement, but also showed that he had participated in the planning long before the operation began. Holt's signature became the first legally significant link tying him to the specific route that was later hijacked. The perpetrators had planned every detail around a specific moment in the route, an officially scheduled stop on 7M Road for routine paperwork delivery to a union-affiliated warehouse. That brief window became the fulcrum of the heist. At 9:47 a.m. on the day of the theft, the armored van made its scheduled stop. As the armored van came to a routine stop, the guard stepped out to deliver a document at a nearby checkpoint. As per procedure, security guard Marvin Daniels exited the vehicle and entered the dispatch kiosk. In that brief window, a man in uniform approached the open driver's side door. He pressed a cloth soaked with sedative over the driver's face, rendering him unconscious within seconds. The real driver was quickly moved into the rear compartment of the van. Hidden from view, the imposter, dressed identically and matching the driver's build, took his place behind the wheel. When the guard returned moments later, he saw no reason for suspicion. The posture, uniform, and cap obscuring the face all looked familiar. He re-entered the van and settled into the passenger seat. Within seconds, the imposter applied the same method, silently subduing the guard. Once unconscious, the guard was not immediately moved. Instead, the imposter resumed the route, driving toward the planned unloading site with the guard slumped beside him. Unnoticed by anyone outside, the van continued on its route and turned off near Highland Park. Butler had arranged use of a commercial garage leased weeks earlier through a shell company under a false name. The site had been cleared in advance and repurposed for a fast transfer. The vehicle entered the structure undetected. Inside, the crew worked fast. Crates of cash were removed from the van and repackaged into padded boxes marked as metal scrap. The shipping paperwork had been prepared in advance. Within hours, the money would leave the city aboard a legitimate freight truck operated under Butler's Department of Transportation license. Back in the van, the original crew was bound with plastic ties. From the outside, the van looked idle. No windows were broken, no doors were forced, and the engine was cut. They drove the vehicle a few blocks away and parked it near another closed facility, leaving the back doors unlocked and keys in the ignition. At 11:26 a.m., an anonymous caller contacted police, reporting a suspicious truck. Officers arrived minutes later. The van showed no signs of damage. The cargo seal had been cut neatly, not pried, not slashed. The dashboard, locks, and ignition were intact. Inside, both men were unconscious, but breathing. Daniels was slumped in the front seat. Price lay stretched out in the back. No physical injuries were recorded, but both men reported sudden drowsiness before blacking out. They were taken to Detroit Receiving Hospital. Blood work returned inconclusive. No narcotics, no alcohol, no clear sedatives were found. Both men were disoriented and slow to respond, but stabilized within hours. The contents of the van had been cleared out with precision. The estimated value of the missing shipment in bearer bonds and cash totaled $1.9 million. There had been no resistance, no forced entry, and no trace of the perpetrators. The van itself had become a container of silence, its crew disabled, its cargo gone, its trail erased. The robbery had occurred in daylight without visible force, without alerting dispatch, and without any of the surveillance mechanisms now standard. All official documentation showed the vehicle followed its assigned schedule until the brief interruption. Charlene Green, the former bookkeeping employee, re-entered the narrative through banking records. The tuition payment for Holt's son, made months later, was the first formal trace. Green had acted as the laundering channel. She had no prior criminal history, but possessed the administrative knowledge required to layer and transfer the funds. Through a series of transactions routed via an Illinois-based front, portions of the stolen money were cleaned and distributed into legitimate accounts. This was not a crime born out of desperation or violence. It was a heist built on routine, trust, and institutional blind spots. The perpetrators used familiarity as camouflage, planning as their weapon. At every step they remained just inside the limits of suspicion. For 31 years the silence held. Files were boxed and shelved, witnesses retired, leads faded. but the discovery of a single misplaced document reignited everything. That signature, Edward Holt's on a memo he was never supposed to see, tied the operation together. The theft was no longer just an unsolved mystery. It was a coordinated act with defined roles, strategic timing, and execution that bordered on surgical. In January 2020, following a month-long confidential inquiry, charges were officially brought against Charlene Green. She was accused of complicity in laundering stolen funds, assisting in the concealment of criminal proceeds, and facilitating unauthorized financial transfers. Green, then in her early 60s, was not a public figure. She had maintained a low profile working in private sector finance consulting until her quiet retirement in 2015. Court documents revealed that Green had been in direct contact with Edward Holt in the months following the heist. Her bank account showed numerous mid-sized deposits during that period, many of which were subsequently distributed across third-party holding companies registered in Delaware, Nevada, and offshore jurisdictions. Investigators traced her activity through subpoenas and cross-border requests, confirming that the laundered money had originated from a Detroit-based armored transport firm, now defunct, known to have employed both Holt and the two men involved in the operation. Faced with mounting forensic and documentary evidence, Green entered a plea agreement. She admitted to processing illicit transfers on Holt's behalf, stating that she had never asked questions about the source of the money. Her cooperation contributed to the reconstruction of the laundering pathway, though she claimed to have had no knowledge of the actual robbery. The court handed down a suspended sentence of 2.5 years and imposed a restitution fine of $220,000 payable over 5 years. Her conviction marked the first and only sentencing in the case. A federal arrest warrant was issued for James Carey. He was charged with active involvement in the execution of the robbery, including the use of a sedative agent and impersonation to gain access to the armored truck. Carey's whereabouts remained unknown. Carey's last known address had been vacated in 1992. His driver's license expired in 1995 and was never renewed. All subsequent sightings were unconfirmed. Attempts to trace his movements through tax records, employment databases, or health systems yielded nothing. He was officially added to the U.S. Marshal's list of wanted fugitives with suspected aliases, including James Monroe and Kenneth Bell. A $50,000 federal reward was posted for information leading to his arrest. Edward Holt, identified as the primary architect of the plan, had died in 2018 of natural causes in California. Though never prosecuted in his lifetime, multiple pieces of evidence confirmed his central role. He had retained access to route information through former colleagues and attended a planning meeting shortly before the theft. Holt orchestrated the timeline, selected the location, and used his familiarity with the company's procedures to mask the operation as a routine delay. Ronald Butler, the third confirmed participant, died in 2006 in Texas. He had operated the transport company used to relocate the stolen cargo after the heist. Financial records showed direct links between his firm and temporary warehouse leases, as well as short-haul shipments departing the Highland Park garage in the week following the robbery. Though he left no confession, his role was corroborated through bank transfers, shipping manifests, and witness statements from warehouse staff who identified him from old records. Investigators concluded that the crime had been executed without weapons, digital compromise, or visible confrontation. Each participant operated strictly within his or her zone of access. Holt manipulated the schedule and inserted a false stop using former colleagues and unofficial drafts. Carey impersonated a technician and performed the chemical incapacitation inside the truck. Butler managed the vehicle's diversion, coordinated the unloading process at the Highland Park garage, and contracted a disposal service that removed the disguised boxes under a general freight license. Green's role came after the physical movement of assets, processing, fractioning, and quietly distributing funds in a way that eluded detection for decades. All key findings were documented in the task force's final report. Investigators reconstructed the crime using internal memos, vehicle logs, sealed personnel records, and the crucial discovery made by Lisa Harper, a graduate student at the University of Michigan who had found a folded route log misplaced inside an archived ledger. Her accidental discovery led to the unsealing of the case and became the starting point for modern forensic analysis. After graduation, Harper joined a nonprofit journalism outlet focused on unsolved crimes and later published a long-form article that became a foundational account of the case's revival. Mark Davis, in 2022, produced and released a documentary examining the entire case from planning to evasion using interviews, court transcripts, and reenactments based strictly on confirmed case files. The film aired on local stations. While the case gained public attention and partial closure, the most direct participant in the physical operation, James Carey, remained missing. The case was not declared fully closed, but prosecutors stated that no further indictments were anticipated unless new evidence emerged. In the end, the story left behind no heroic chases or dramatic arrests. By the end of 2023, authorities had recovered and documented approximately 70% of the stolen funds through account seizures and cooperative restitution from estate transfers. But a significant portion remained unaccounted for, possibly hidden in non-traceable assets, burned cash, or long-closed accounts. The conclusion of the case demonstrated that even the most controlled operations could unravel from a forgotten file. Truth suppressed for decades had survived inside a misfiled document and surfaced not through confession or betrayal, but by accident. A missing log entry, a folded page, a dusty ledger retrieved from a storage room shelf. And in that moment, history shifted.